Eliza Hawkins smiled as she shut the door behind her. The soft clink of her keys on the hall table marked the end of a long day, and she breathed in the familiar scent of lavender and eucalyptus that filled her home. Everything was just as she left it, warm, inviting, and beautifully designed with care. Her hands lingered on the wall, tracing the patterns of the wallpaper she had chosen herself, a perfect backdrop for her life with Dave. They had been married for 10 years, and to anyone looking from the outside, their lives were an image of success and harmony. Dave, a partner at a prestigious law firm, made time for romantic dinners despite his busy schedule, and Eliza's work as a freelance designer allowed her the flexibility to make their home a haven. Friends often commented on how lucky they were, how perfect their lives seemed. Eliza believed it too, most of the time. But lately, something had been gnawing at the edges of her peace. There was a restlessness she couldn't name, a shift in Dave's energy that left her feeling unbalanced. He had always been devoted, but in the past 6 months, his eyes seemed to wander even when he was sitting across from her, his mind far away even when they were together. She shook off the thought and headed for the kitchen, already planning the dinner she'd surprise him with tonight. It was a small gesture, but in her mind, it would help bridge whatever invisible gap had opened between them. Just as she opened the fridge to pull out ingredients, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Dave. Running late again. Work emergency. Rain check on dinner? Her hand froze over the vegetables, her heart sinking a little. It wasn't unusual for him to stay late, but something about tonight felt different. Her intuition prickled, a quiet voice whispering doubts she wasn't ready to listen to yet. It's just work, she muttered to herself, closing the fridge. He's always busy, but the feeling lingered. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat, deciding to take a walk to clear her mind. Maybe a change of scenery would help shake off this unease. She walked down the street, the cool evening air brushing her cheeks, the city alive with its usual hum. Just as she passed a familiar restaurant, a spot Dave often frequented for business dinners, she caught a glimpse of something that made her heart stop. There, through the large glass windows, sat Dave. But he wasn't alone. He was at a table with a woman, young and striking, her hand resting on his across the table. The sight hit Eliza like a punch to the stomach. For a moment, she couldn't move, her feet glued to the sidewalk as she stared at them, disbelieving. Maybe it's a work meeting, she reasoned, her mind scrambling for any explanation. But then she saw the way Dave looked at the woman, the softness in his eyes that used to be reserved for her. The woman smiled, and Dave leaned in, saying something that made her laugh, her fingers curling around his. Eliza turned on her heel, her stomach twisting with nausea. She couldn't watch anymore. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts as she hurried down the street, her mind racing. Was it possible she had misunderstood? Could there be an innocent explanation? But deep down, she knew. By the time she returned home, her mind was a blur. She wanted to confront him immediately, to demand answers, but she couldn't trust herself to think straight. Instead, she sat in the quiet of their living room, staring at the pictures on the mantel, their wedding photo, smiling and carefree, a lifetime of love and trust captured in a single moment. She felt like an outsider, looking in on a life that no longer felt like her own. The next morning, Eliza couldn't shake the memory of what she had seen. Dave acted normal, as if nothing had happened, and that only made her doubts louder. The questions buzzed in her head all day, until she could barely concentrate on work. That evening, after Dave left for another late meeting, she made a decision. She would find out the truth, no matter what it took. A quick search led her to a private investigator, and without hesitation, she dialed the number. Her voice trembled as she explained her situation, but the investigator spoke calmly, offering his services with the promise of discretion. "I'll find out what's going on," he assured her. "You'll have the answers soon." Weeks passed, and Eliza tried to carry on as if everything was normal, but the waiting gnawed at her. She kept busy, throwing herself into her design work, but her thoughts always drifted back to Dave and that woman. Who was she? What did she mean to him? And why hadn't he told her? Then, one afternoon, the investigator called. "Eliza," he said, his tone somber. "I have the information you asked for. Can we meet?" Her heart pounded in her chest as they arranged to meet at a nearby cafe. When she saw him walk through the door with a manila envelope in hand, her stomach dropped. He sat across from her, sliding the envelope toward her without a word. Eliza stared at it for a moment, afraid to open it, afraid of what she would find inside. But she had come too far to turn back now. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and pulled out the photos. There they were, Dave and the woman from the restaurant, together in various places over the past few months. They weren't just business associates. The truth stared back at her from every image. Her heart shattered. "Eliza," the investigator said gently, "the woman's name is Verena. She's a businesswoman, quite successful. She and your husband have been seeing each other for about 6 months. 6 months." The room spun as Eliza tried to absorb the words. She could barely breathe, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her chest. She thanked the investigator, though the words felt hollow in her mouth, and walked back home in a daze. Every step felt like she was sinking deeper into a nightmare she couldn't escape. Later that night, she confronted Dave, the photos spread out on the coffee table between them. The look on his face when he saw them told her everything she needed to know. "Eliza," he began, but she cut him off, her voice trembling with emotion. "How long?" she asked, her hands shaking. Dave sighed, running a hand through his hair. 6 months, he admitted quietly, his eyes filled with a guilt that did nothing to soothe her pain. "And her? Who is she?" "Her name is Verena." I didn't plan for this to happen, Eliza. It just did." Eliza felt the tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Do you love her?" Dave hesitated for a moment too long. "Yes," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I think I do." The words sliced through her like a knife. All the years they had spent together, all the memories, now felt like they were unraveling before her eyes. "I'm sorry," Dave continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've felt trapped, suffocated. I never meant to hurt you, but I can't keep pretending anymore." Eliza stared at him, her mind racing with the weight of his confession. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, was crumbling around her. And she had no idea how to stop it. Eliza sat at the long wooden table in her kitchen, staring blankly at the divorce papers in front of her. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a soft glow on the surface, but inside, she felt nothing but cold. After hours of tossing and turning the night before, she had made her decision. There was no other way. She was going to divorce Dave. The thought alone felt like ripping apart the fabric of her life. 10 years of marriage, all the shared memories, the laughter, the tears, were reduced to a legal document, a battle over what would remain of her shattered world. Her hands trembled as she picked up the pen, and for a brief second, she hesitated. Was this really happening? Was this how her marriage would end, after everything they had built together? But then, her mind flashed back to the images of Dave and Verena, their intertwined hands, the undeniable connection between them. Yes. It was happening. With a deep breath, she signed her name. When she confronted Dave about the divorce later that evening, the conversation was short, clipped. He was cool, almost indifferent, as though he had already made peace with it. Eliza, however, felt every word like a fresh wound. "We'll need to sort out the details, of course," Dave said, his tone professional, almost detached. "But I think it's best for both of us if we make this as quick and clean as possible." Eliza nodded, though the reality of what he was saying stung deeply. I want to keep the house, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dave's eyes flickered, something hard and calculating passing behind them. I'm not sure that's the best option. Her heart sank. What do you mean? Eliza, Dave sighed, as though the conversation was a minor inconvenience. Verena and we've been talking. We think it would be better if we took the house. It's too big for you alone anyway. Eliza blinked, the words hitting her like a slap. Verena and The casual way he brought her name into their lives, their home, it was unbearable. This is my house, she said, her voice firmer now. It was my grandmother's. It's where I grew up. Exactly, Dave replied, his lawyer persona slipping back into place. It's a family home. It would make more sense for us to have it, especially when we start our own family. Her breath caught in her throat. Their own family. The thought twisted something deep inside her, but it also ignited a spark she hadn't felt in weeks. She wouldn't give up her home. Not to him. Not to them. No, she said firmly, her eyes locking with his. I'm not giving up the house. Dave's smile was thin, almost condescending. We'll see. From that moment, the divorce went from a mutual decision to a full-blown war. Dave used every bit of his influence as a successful lawyer to gain the upper hand. His connections in the legal world became tools to push Eliza into a corner, threatening to drown her in endless motions and paperwork. It wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about control. Dave and Verena were determined to make this process as difficult as possible for her, and Eliza was beginning to see a side of her husband she had never imagined existed. The man she had loved for a decade was gone, replaced by someone cold, calculating, and ruthless. Days turned into weeks, and the battle took its toll on her. She felt like she was drowning in the legal mess, the weight of it pressing down on her chest every single day. Dave's lawyer was relentless, exploiting every technicality, twisting every word. Eliza tried to negotiate, tried to find some middle ground, but it quickly became clear that Dave had no interest in fairness. He wanted everything, and he wasn't going to stop until he got it. Her lawyer at the time wasn't strong enough to fight back, and after another painful meeting where Dave's team threatened to drag the process out indefinitely, Eliza knew she had to do something drastic. That night, after pacing the floor of her bedroom for what felt like hours, she called the best divorce attorney in town, Finn Marlowe. His reputation was legendary, and he was known for taking on cases that seemed impossible. Eliza explained her situation over the phone, her voice shaking with exhaustion and fear. I'll take the case, Finn said after a moment of silence. His voice was steady, confident. But you need to be prepared. This won't be easy. Eliza knew it wouldn't be. But hearing his voice, that strength, gave her a flicker of hope. The next morning, Finn took over, and Eliza felt an immediate shift in the air. He was sharp, methodical, and unafraid to challenge every move Dave's legal team made. Slowly, bit by bit, Finn began to turn the tide in her favor, and for the first time in weeks, Eliza felt like she could breathe again. But the legal battle wasn't the only war she was fighting. Eliza's world had grown smaller, darker, and lonelier. As the news of her divorce spread through their circle of friends, she found herself increasingly isolated. The people she thought would be there for her, who she thought were true friends, began to distance themselves. Some, she discovered, had known about Dave's affair long before she did but had said nothing, preferring to stay out of the mess. The betrayal cut deep. Eliza found herself questioning everything and everyone, the loneliness of it all more suffocating than the divorce itself. Her one saving grace was Tala, her younger sister. When Tala found out what was happening, she dropped everything and flew back to town to be by Eliza's side. Tala had always been the more free-spirited of the two, but now her grounded strength was exactly what Eliza needed. You're not alone in this, Tala said one night, sitting with Eliza on the front porch, the cool evening air brushing their faces. You've always been strong, Elle. You just forgot for a while. But I'm here to remind you. Eliza leaned her head against Tala's shoulder, her heart aching with gratitude. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but with Finn in her corner and Tala by her side, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months: hope. She wasn't going to let Dave win. Not the house, not the life they had built together, not her future. This was her battle now, and she was ready to fight. The final gavel sounded, and with it, the legal battle was over. Eliza had won. The house, her grandmother's house, the one she had fought so hard for, was hers. But as she stood outside the courthouse, staring at the city she had called home for years, a strange emptiness settled over her. The victory, as sweet as she had imagined, felt hollow now. Dave was gone. Her marriage was over. The life she had built was in ruins. She returned to the house that night, unlocking the front door with a sense of finality. The familiar warmth of the rooms, the history embedded in every creak of the floorboards, once gave her comfort, but now it felt like a mausoleum, a relic of a life that no longer existed. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness, and as she moved through the house, she realized she couldn't stay here anymore. Not after everything that had happened. The next morning, Eliza made the decision to leave. She packed up the house, keeping only a few cherished belongings, and sold it. It was time to start over, somewhere far away from the people and memories tied to her old life. Her new apartment was modest, situated in a quiet neighborhood in a city where no one knew her name. It was the blank slate she thought she needed, a chance to begin again. She found a new job at a small interior design firm, where she could bury herself in work, losing hours rearranging colors and textures for clients who didn't ask about her past. The people in her new life were polite but distant, and Eliza was grateful for that. She didn't want to talk about what she had been through, didn't want to open up old wounds. But as the weeks went by, loneliness clung to her like a shadow. Her days became a dull, repetitive cycle: work, come home to an empty apartment, eat dinner alone, and take short walks through the nearby park. The silence of her new life was deafening, and it made the ghosts of her old one louder. She saw Dave's face in every reflection, heard the echoes of their conversations in the quiet moments between tasks. Her heart ached with a deep, persistent grief that no amount of distance could heal. One evening, during one of her aimless walks, Eliza found herself wandering through an unfamiliar part of the park, her feet moving on autopilot. She stopped in front of a woman sitting on a bench, painting. The woman's hands moved gracefully across the canvas, creating broad strokes of color, and something about the way she worked caught Eliza's attention. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the woman said without looking up, sensing Eliza's presence. She turned slightly, her eyes soft and welcoming. "Would you like to join me?" Eliza hesitated. She hadn't touched a paintbrush in years, not since she was a child. But there was something inviting about the woman's smile, something that made Eliza feel seen for the first time in months. "I wouldn't know where to start," Eliza admitted. The woman laughed gently. "That's the beauty of art. You don't need to know. You just start. I'm Ariana, by the way." "Eliza," she replied, surprised at how easily the introduction slipped from her lips. Ariana patted the empty space on the bench beside her. "Come sit. I teach an art class a few blocks from here. Nothing formal, just a group of people trying to reconnect with themselves through creativity. Why don't you come by tomorrow? See if it feels right." For the first time in months, Eliza felt a flicker of curiosity. Something in her chest stirred, a faint spark of interest in the world outside the narrow confines of her mind. "I'll think about it," she said, but deep down, she knew she'd go. The next evening, Eliza walked into a small, sunlit studio. The walls were lined with canvases, some finished, some half done, and the air smelled faintly of paint and clay. Ariana greeted her with the same warm smile, and soon, Eliza found herself sitting at a table with brushes and a blank canvas in front of her. The other people in the room were already absorbed in their work, but when Ariana introduced her, they looked up and offered kind, understanding nods. Eliza could sense that this group was different from any she had been part of before. They were not here to impress or compete, they were here to heal, in their own way. Over the next few weeks, Eliza returned to the studio again and again, her hands becoming more familiar with the feel of paint and brushes, her mind slowly unraveling as she allowed herself to create without judgment. She began to learn the stories of the other artists, quiet stories shared over cups of tea during breaks. There was Peter, who had lost his wife to cancer. Anna, who was navigating the bitter aftermath of a divorce. Carla, who had survived a deep betrayal by a lifelong friend. In their stories, Eliza began to see reflections of her own pain, and for the first time, she realized that she wasn't alone. There were others who carried scars just like hers, and somehow, in this small studio, surrounded by art and quiet resilience, healing didn't seem so impossible anymore. One night, after class, Ariana walked Eliza to the door. "You're doing great," she said, her voice low and soothing. "You don't have to rush it. Healing isn't a straight line." "I don't even know if I'm healing," Eliza admitted, the words coming out in a fragile whisper. Ariana smiled softly. "That's the thing about healing. You never realize it's happening until one day, you wake up and the weight feels just a little bit lighter." Eliza nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. But there was something about Ariana's words that stayed with her, a quiet hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. As the months passed, Eliza's routine began to change, little by little. She still had lonely nights, still found herself haunted by memories she couldn't quite shake. But the art, the small connections she was forming with people who understood, gave her something to look forward to. She started taking longer walks, exploring parts of the city she hadn't seen before. The world around her, once a blur of noise and colors she'd barely noticed, started to come into focus again. She found herself smiling at strangers, stopping to watch children play in the park, and even enjoying her solitary dinners, savoring the peace of her own company. It wasn't an easy journey. There were days when the weight of the past pressed down so heavily she could barely get out of bed. But each time, she reminded herself of Ariana's words. Healing wasn't linear. It was slow, uncertain, and messy. But it was happening. One afternoon, as she stood in front of a half-finished painting, Eliza felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't thinking about Dave, or the house, or the life she had lost. She was simply there, in the moment, creating something entirely her own. Eliza sat at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee and scrolling through the news on her phone, when her eyes landed on a headline that made her blood run cold. Power couple, Dave Arlo and Verena Thompson take the business world by storm with their new venture. Her heart thudded in her chest as she stared at the glossy photo of Dave and Verena, smiling and triumphant, looking every bit the perfect pair. The article praised their business acumen, hailing them as rising stars in the tech industry. The world loved them, adored them even. And here they were, thriving, while Eliza was still picking up the pieces of her shattered life. Something inside her snapped. It wasn't fair. After everything they had done, after the betrayal, the lies, the brutal legal battle, how could they be celebrated while she was left with nothing but scars? She had lost so much. Her marriage, her trust in people, the friends who had abandoned her. The injustice of it boiled inside her until she couldn't breathe. She could not sit idly by any longer. That night, Eliza's mind raced with thoughts of revenge. She had tried moving on, tried finding peace, but this success of Dave and Verena, was too much. They had taken everything from her, and now they were building a new life, without any consequences. But what if she could be the consequence? What if, instead of walking away, she could take something from them? She spent the next few weeks carefully crafting a plan. Eliza had always been meticulous. Her attention to detail was what made her a successful designer. But this time, she wasn't designing cozy living spaces, she was designing destruction. And her target was Verena. Through quiet, methodical research, Eliza began digging into Verena's past. She trawled through public records, old articles, social media posts, anything that could give her an edge. Verena had built a perfect image, young, successful, philanthropic. But Eliza was determined to find a crack. And eventually, she did. Buried in the archives of an old financial report, Eliza uncovered a connection between Verena and the scandal from years ago. Verena had been involved in questionable business dealings in the early stages of her career, dealings that had been quietly swept under the rug before she rose to prominence. The information was buried so deep that no one had ever connected the dots, but Eliza's relentless pursuit had paid off. With this knowledge in hand, she began leaking the information anonymously, planting it strategically in places where it would slowly spread. At first, it was small, a whisper on an industry blog, a hint in a comment thread on a business forum. But soon, those whispers grew louder. Eliza watched from the shadows as her plan took shape. Bit by bit, Verena's perfect reputation began to unravel. Rumors spread, and before long, the media caught wind of the story. Questions were being asked, and Verena found herself at the center of a storm. Investors began to pull out of her projects, and her once flawless image started to crack under the pressure. Eliza became cold-blooded during this time, focused solely on her goal. She felt herself hardening, her compassion and warmth buried under the icy determination for revenge. Each time she saw another article questioning Verena's integrity, a twisted sense of satisfaction curled inside her. She was finally taking control. Finally making them pay. But as the days went by, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling triumphant, Eliza began to feel hollow. One night, after another particularly damning article surfaced, Eliza sat alone in her apartment, staring at her reflection in the dark window. Verena was on the verge of losing everything: her career, her reputation, her place in the business world. Eliza had won. So why did it feel like she had lost something, too? The emptiness gnawed at her. She had been so focused on destroying Verena that she hadn't realized how much it was destroying her. Her obsession with revenge had consumed her, turned her into someone she barely recognized. Her days had become filled with bitterness and calculation, and the joy she had once sought in her new life was now nothing more than a distant memory. Eliza pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to stop the flood of guilt that was rising inside her. She had thought this would bring her peace, that watching Verena fall would somehow heal the pain Dave and she had caused. But it hadn't. It hadn't erased the betrayal or brought her any closer to happiness. All it had done was deepen her isolation, her sense of being lost. She thought of the art studio, the people she had met there. The quiet healing she had started to find through creativity and connection. She had abandoned that path for revenge, but now she saw the truth. Tearing down others wasn't helping her rebuild her own life. It never would. The next day, Eliza made the hardest decision she had faced since leaving her old life behind. She stopped. She stopped the leaks, the anonymous tips, the plotting. She abandoned the plan she had so carefully crafted, letting go of the power she had wielded. That evening, she went back to the art studio for the first time in weeks. As she walked through the door, Ariana greeted her with a knowing smile. "You've been away for a while," Ariana said, her eyes soft with understanding. "But it's good to see you back." Eliza nodded, her heart heavy but hopeful. "I lost myself for a bit." Ariana didn't ask for details, and for that, Eliza was grateful. Instead, she handed Eliza a brush and a blank canvas. "Here," she said gently. "Start over." Eliza took the brush, the weight of it familiar and comforting. She stared at the blank canvas in front of her, feeling a strange mix of fear and relief. She had spent so long trying to destroy someone else's life, but now it was time to rebuild her own. With a deep breath, Eliza made the first stroke on the canvas. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't need to be. It was a beginning. The flight to Europe was long, but Eliza barely noticed. As the plane soared above the clouds, she felt the weight of the past slowly start to peel away. It had been months since she abandoned her pursuit of revenge against Dave and Verena, and although the decision had left her raw and vulnerable, it had also opened a new chapter in her life, one she was determined to fill with purpose and meaning. The trip was a step into the unknown. She had always dreamed of visiting Europe, but the timing had never been right. Her life with Dave had been too wrapped up in his ambitions, their shared responsibilities. Now, for the first time, Eliza was living on her own terms. She had nothing to lose and everything to gain. She spent the first few days in Paris, wandering through the cobblestone streets, visiting art galleries, and sitting in quaint cafes, watching the world go by. It was peaceful, even healing, but it wasn't until she reached a small town in Italy that something deep inside her truly began to shift. The town was nestled in the hills of Tuscany, surrounded by fields of olive trees and vineyards that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was a place that seemed untouched by time, with narrow, winding streets and stone houses that felt centuries old. The pace of life here was slow, serene, a far cry from the frantic rush of her old life. One afternoon, as she was sitting in the town square, sketching the outline of an old church, an elderly man approached her. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a basket of fresh produce, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile as he caught sight of her drawings. "Bellissimo," he said, pointing to the sketch with admiration. "You capture the soul of this place." Eliza smiled shyly, feeling a flicker of pride at his compliment. "Thank you. I'm just trying to capture what I see." "What you see is important," the man said, sitting down on the bench beside her. "But it's what you feel that truly brings a place to life." They exchanged introductions, and Eliza learned that his name was Lorenzo. He was a lifelong resident of the town, a retired winemaker, and, as he soon revealed, a man who had seen more of life than she could have ever imagined. Over the next few days, Lorenzo became a constant presence during her stay. They would meet in the square or on a hillside overlooking the vineyards, and he would share stories of his life, of the vineyard he had built from scratch, of the love he had found and lost, of the hardships he had faced and the joys that had come afterward. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Tuscan hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Eliza asked him about his losses. "How did you move on?" she asked softly, her voice filled with the same quiet pain she had carried for months. Lorenzo took a long, slow breath, his eyes gazing at the horizon as if searching for the right words. "You don't move on, not really," he said. "You carry those losses with you. But with time, they become part of the mosaic of your life. They don't define you. They shape you, but they don't own you." Eliza looked at him, absorbing the wisdom in his words. She had spent so long feeling like her past defined her, like the betrayal and heartache were the only things that mattered. But here was Lorenzo, a man who had lived through his own share of heartbreaks, telling her that there was more to life, that she could be more than the sum of her pain. "You find new meaning," Lorenzo continued. "Not by forgetting, but by letting your experiences guide you to new places. Life isn't about what you lose, it's about what you build from those losses." Eliza felt something stir inside her, a quiet but powerful realization. Lorenzo was right. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about weaving it into the fabric of who she was and allowing it to guide her towards something new. When she returned home from Europe, she was filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The trip had been more than just a vacation, it had been a journey back to herself. Inspired by Lorenzo's words and the beauty she had witnessed abroad, Eliza decided it was time to stop running from her life and start building a new one one that reflected her truth. She found a small space on a quiet street and opened a design studio. It wasn't anything grand or ambitious, just a modest, sunlit room where she could create, surrounded by art supplies and fabrics, her mind free to dream. But from the moment she stepped into that space, Eliza knew it was more than just a job. It was a sanctuary, a place where she could pour her soul into her work, express the parts of herself she had long kept hidden. The studio became her haven. She started designing unique, handmade pieces, furniture, home decor, textiles, all of which reflected the journey she had been on. Her designs were full of life, color, and intricate details, each one telling a small story of resilience, hope, and transformation. People began to take notice, drawn to the raw, emotional beauty of her creations. Word spread, and soon her studio became a gathering place for others who were looking to express their own inner worlds through art. She began offering workshops, teaching people how to design their own pieces, encouraging them to pour their stories into their work. The studio became a place of healing, not just for Eliza, but for everyone who walked through its doors. As the months went by, Eliza began to feel something she hadn't experienced in a long time: joy. It wasn't a dramatic or overwhelming sensation, but a quiet, steady current that flowed through her days. She found herself laughing more, connecting with people in ways she hadn't before. Her life, once filled with bitterness and grief, was now marked by creativity, connection, and purpose. One evening, as the last rays of the sun filtered through the studio's windows, Eliza stood back and looked at the space she had created. It was small, but it was hers. It was a reflection of everything she had been through, and everything she was becoming. She smiled to herself, feeling a deep sense of contentment. For the first time in a long time, Eliza felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. And as she looked toward the future, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with strength, grace, and the quiet understanding that she had the power to rebuild her life, on her own terms. The soft chime of the doorbell echoed through Eliza's design studio, pulling her attention from the fabric she was arranging on the workbench. She looked up and saw a man standing just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the room with quiet curiosity. He was tall, with dark hair and an air of calmness that seemed to settle around him. "Hi," he said, offering a small, polite smile as he approached the counter. "I'm looking for something unique, a gift for my sister." Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and returned the smile. "You've come to the right place. What's the occasion?" "Her birthday," he replied, glancing at the various pieces of art and furniture scattered around the room. "She loves anything handmade, especially if it's got a story behind it." Eliza nodded, gesturing toward a corner of the studio where several one-of-a-kind pieces were displayed. "Everything here is made by hand. Most of it has a story, something personal woven into the design." The man walked over, studying the items carefully. His movements were slow, thoughtful, as if he took his time with every decision. When he reached out to touch the edge of a hand-carved wooden jewelry box, he paused and glanced back at Eliza. "This one. What's its story?" Eliza walked over to him, her fingers tracing the intricate pattern on the lid of the box. "I made this one when I was going through a difficult time. The carvings represent resilience, how we can grow through our hardest moments." The man nodded, his expression softening. "I think she'll love it. I'll take it." Their interaction was brief, but as he paid for the box and thanked her, Eliza found herself unexpectedly drawn to him. There was something about his presence that felt different, steady, reassuring, without the usual pretenses that often accompanied first meetings. He left with a quiet, "See you around," and for the next few days, Eliza found herself thinking about him, wondering if he'd ever return. Weeks passed, and then one afternoon, the bell chimed again. There he was, standing in the doorway, a familiar smile on his face. "Hi again," he said, walking over to her workbench. "My sister loved the box, by the way. I think it made her cry." Eliza laughed softly. I hope they were good tears. They were, he replied. I've been meaning to come back. I guess I was looking for an excuse. They talked more that day, about art, about family, about the small moments in life that mattered most. His name, she learned, was Caden. He worked as a landscape architect, designing gardens and outdoor spaces, something he was deeply passionate about. His calm, thoughtful demeanor made it easy for Eliza to open up, to share pieces of her life she hadn't spoken about in a long time. As the weeks turned into months, Caden became a regular visitor to the studio. He'd stop by to say hello, ask about her latest projects, or simply sit in the corner with a cup of coffee while she worked. Their conversations flowed easily, and over time, Eliza found herself looking forward to his visits more and more. It wasn't long before their friendship deepened into something more. It happened slowly, naturally, with no pressure or expectations. Caden was patient, never pushing Eliza for more than she was ready to give, and that gentle support allowed her to lower the walls she had built around her heart. One evening, as they walked through the park together, the sun setting behind the trees, Caden reached for her hand. Eliza hesitated for just a moment before lacing her fingers with his. The warmth of his touch was steady, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for this again, Eliza admitted softly, looking up at him. Caden stopped and turned to face her, his expression filled with quiet understanding. You don't have to rush anything. I'll be here, no matter what. That was all she needed to hear. Their relationship blossomed from there, growing slowly but deeply. For the first time in a long while, Eliza felt truly supported, not just emotionally but in every aspect of her life. Caden wasn't just a companion, he became her partner in every sense of the word. His calm presence brought balance to her days, and his unwavering belief in her helped Eliza believe in herself again. A year after they met, they stood together in a small garden surrounded by close friends and family, exchanging vows beneath an archway of flowers. The wedding was simple, intimate, filled with laughter and love. As they said, "I do," Eliza felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. This was her second chance, not just at love, but at life. A few months later, they welcomed their first child, a baby boy who filled their home with joy and laughter. Holding him in her arms for the first time, Eliza felt a wave of emotion that was almost overwhelming. This child, this family, this new life, they were everything she had once feared she might never have again. One evening, as Eliza stood in the living room of their new home, gently rocking her son in her arms, she gazed out the window at the setting sun. The golden light bathed the room in warmth, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt whole. The journey to get here had been long and painful. There had been moments when she didn't think she'd survive the heartache, when the betrayal and loneliness had seemed too much to bear. But now, as she looked around at her life, Eliza knew that every step had been necessary. Every challenge, every moment of doubt, had led her here, surrounded by people who loved her, not for what she had lost, but for who she had become. She thought back to her time in Europe, to the wisdom Lorenzo had shared with her on that hillside in Tuscany. Life isn't about what you lose, it's about what you build from those losses. He had been right. Eliza had rebuilt her life, piece by piece, on her own terms. Her studio was thriving, not just as a business, but as a place where she could help others express their own journeys through creativity. Her home was filled with love and laughter, and her heart, once shattered, had healed in ways she hadn't thought possible. As her son cooed softly in her arms, Eliza smiled, pressing a kiss to his forehead. She had found her place in the world, not through revenge, not through clinging to the past, but through letting go, through growth, through love. And now, as she stood in the soft glow of the evening light, Eliza knew that she had finally found true happiness. Not the fleeting kind, but the kind that was built on a foundation of resilience, peace, and self-restoration. She had come full circle, and the future stretched out before her, bright, hopeful, and full of endless possibilities.